We are at the third point of our election series. We've been meeting as much as possible to talk about what is going on, what we think needs to happen, and where we are going from here. Folks, we are a weekend away from what might be one of the biggest, most consequential elections in our time. And we're trying to talk through what that means. We're trying to cut through the noise because the countdown to election day is upon us. So many people around this country have already voted. We know that early voting has been amazing. Maryland has had lines out the door. People are rushing to the polls to make sure their voice and their votes are heard. But there's some people still on the fence. They're not sure what they should do at this moment, and this is where we come in. I'm joined again today by Kirsten West Savali, VP of Content at Urban One's iOne Digital and former executive producer of news and politics editor for Essence Magazine. Welcome back, Kirsten.
Thank you, Kaye. Good morning.
Good morning. Excited to have you back. And Tim Wise, anti-racist author and senior fellow at the African American Policy Forum. I will not remind you that he's on the list of the 8 wokest white men. I think everybody knows that, but I often say it because I think it talks about how Tim enters the conversation based upon the work he's been doing in this area. Tim, as always, welcome back to the airways.
Thank you very much for having me.
We're looking for a new introduction.
Trying to move up that list, trying to be in the top 5, trying to get to the top 5. So
we appreciate you. So, folks, if you want to check into the last couple of episodes, go to AAPF's, that's the African American Policy Forum's YouTube page, or go straight to our WEAA website. We are here to add some nuance to mainstream media, to talk about this year's election, to take a look at what's been happening at Madison Square Garden, what's been happening at the barbershops. We're covering it all today. So, Kirsten, I want to come to you first as we are trying to frame where we have been. It feels like the election has taken a very ugly turn. Madison Square Garden was extremely disturbing, but for some people, that's been the tone coming from the Republican Party all the way through. Maybe we're just paying more attention to it. So as a lead-in, can you talk specifically about that and maybe what that portends for how we're going forward?
Thank you for that lead in, Kaye. I was so extraordinarily disturbed by, I think, the desperation that I heard. You know, when you think about wounded animals and you think about the last kind of gasp of white supremacy, just this desperation that I saw. And we talked about this, I believe, last week when we were talking about Trump having rallies intentionally in sundown towns. And of course, the correlation has been made to the Nazi rally held in 1939 at Madison Square Garden, a former location, which is now Madison Square Garden. So it feels very intentional. It feels, I can't even say dog whistling. It feels very intentional. I don't know that if it's, well, no, let me change that. It's not anything new. It's just getting louder and louder and louder and louder. And I think about all my friends who are in this work who say that means that the right side is winning. And by the right side, I mean the side for good, the side for freedom, the side for liberation is winning because they're getting louder and louder and louder. So I do also want to point out that this was New York City. It's not Mississippi. It's not Alabama. It's not Georgia. You know, white supremacy is not quarantined to the Deep South. I often say as much violence has happened under the Confederate flag as happened under the United States flag. And there was just so much as a Black woman, as a Black mother to Black Samoan sons, hearing Tucker Carlson talk about her being, you know, Samoan Malaysian, just throwing it out there, just broadening the tent of people that he's targeting, broadening the tent of people that he's othering, them calling her the B word, them saying she's low IQ, using words like slaughter and occupy the country. Those words, I often think of the Russian Revolution and Animal Farm and the ways in which propaganda is used, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but this is just so flagrant. That's really all I can say.
I'm so glad you said that, and thank you so much for that, Kirsten, to just kind of frame it for us. Tim, I want to come to you because I know, based upon conversations we've had, you have some very strong thoughts about what we saw, what we experienced, what we felt as we watched what happened at Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, I mean, what we watched, or the clips that we watched, were essentially Nuremberg rally clips. And, you know, to paraphrase the late, great Molly Ivins and what she said about Pat Buchanan's 1992 RNC speech, said it probably sounded better in the original German, you know, but you still can sort of translate it. What's shocking about it, and Kirsten's right, this isn't new. I mean, this kind of rhetoric, about slaughtering one's opponents or turning the military on them and using racist dog whistles and coded language has been, Donald Trump's shtick since 2015, if not before. But the fact that this is their closing argument, right? The fact that in the final week, they are not trying clearly to get any kind of swing voters with this approach. They are not trying to get disaffected Biden voters who just can't quite make up their mind. They are trying to essentially prime the pump of their base to engage in violence if and when they lose. And I think it is an act of desperation when you bring on a comic who tells jokes about Puerto Rico being a floating garbage pit, who talks about black guys carving watermelons instead of pumpkins for Halloween. Who does that appeal to other than the extremist base that you already have in your pocket? So you're not even at that point trying to add to your vote. You're just trying to make sure, win or lose, your people know who the quote unquote enemies are, right? And so you hire a comic whose entire career has been about insulting people of color, LGBTQ folk, and disabled people, because that's the kind of comic that right wingers, like, the kind that's cruel for cruelty's sake. And what they're doing is preparing that base, if they lose, to lash out violently. So if you can whip your minions into a frenzy with these unhinged xenophobic remarks, and bring out some used up steroid junkie like Hulk Hogan and an unlicensed psychologist like Dr. Phil, right? And then other people that say Democrats are satanic. That was also said from the stage. What you're doing is saying these people are evil. It's not just that we disagree on policy. It's not just that they have this view about tax rates and we have this view, or they have this view about immigration and we have this view. They are literally saying that Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party are going to destroy the country. By the way, that comic they brought on, all of his material was uploaded onto the prompter. They knew exactly what he was going to say. And in fact, they stopped him from using the C word to describe Kamala Harris. They said, oh, that's too far. Oh, we can't do that. But we can insult Puerto Ricans and we can insult black folks because that's sort of our brand, right? They are telling you who they are. And I think we all just simply need to suggest that it's time for us to do better than that. And I think that there are Americans who will respond to what that was. There are people in the base who will go, hell yeah, and they'll be excited by that kind of rhetoric. But I got to tell you, and I'm not known for cheery optimism, but I want to say this. I really believe that the bulk of Americans don't like that. They're tired of that. They're tired of the kind of racism and sexism that this man and his movement have made such a prominent part of our daily politics. Look, we're all conditioned to internalize a certain degree of racism and sexism in this culture. It's not unique to MAGA. It's not unique to Donald Trump or to his followers. We all have ingested some of that.
I'm glad you said that, Tim, and thank you so much for your comments, Kirsten. We have been talking a lot with the comparison with 1939 till today. And I actually feel that it's worse than 1939. I mean, 85 years ago, the country was in a different place. We were a different place when it came to race relations. You're talking about 39, before Brown v. Board, before we had the push for the civil rights movement. Women were in a different place back 85 years ago. I mean, we're celebrating 50 years of being able to get credit cards now. We're at that point. We were very different. You didn't have social media. You didn't have the lessons learned from World War II. The country was different in 1939 than it is now, which makes it so much worse. Because we have been doing this work, because we have seen what happened coming out of World War II, because we remember the civil rights movement, because we've experienced Black Lives Matter, because we've had Barack Obama in the White House, because we have blacks in all these positions, Hispanics in all these positions, it's actually much worse. To hear that, to experience that, and to realize despite all the gains made, despite the fact that there were Hispanics in the office, in the audience, and black folks in the audience and on the stage, that this is a type of behavior that's kind of masked as a joke that really gives the true ideology of Donald Trump and the Trumplicans. My bigger concern, before we move on and kind of go back into a real dovetailer of the media and what that means, my concern is that when we look at how much money has been spent on this election, you're talking roughly about $15.9 billion up till now. And we know that is money that could transform this nation. People that are economically challenged, schools. I mean, we could just start laying out a whole wish list of what $15.9 billion could do. But what concerns me, if by chance Donald Trump is victorious this coming Tuesday, it is showing me that no matter how much money we throw at it, no matter how much Kamala Harris's machine is working, no matter how much people have given their time, their money, their effort, that Republican machine is set up in such a way that it's almost unbeatable. And that is what's really concerning me, because his base is not going down. Like, Madison Square Garden didn't change his poll numbers. In fact, they've gone up. And I am not sure how we beat something that people can look and say, yes, it's racist, yes, it's sexist, but at least it's not the Democratic Party. At least it's not Kamala Harris. That type of circular logic, it's hard to beat. And so, Kirsten, I come back to you just with just some of these concerns and maybe what you see that concerns you at this moment going into the last few days here.
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. It makes me angry when we have Democrats as well who try to negotiate with this kind of white supremacy. Republicans aren't trying to broaden their tent and say, hey, let's give a little bit. Let's meet in the middle. You know, when you have the Joe Bidens platituding away about James O. Eastland, when you have a Michelle Obama who's BFFs with George Bush, when you have a Kamala Harris platforming Liz Cheney, you know, these maggots have gone off the cliff, and it allows Democrats to just keep scooting on further into the right and negotiate with the white supremacy that never compromises. Trump, like Tim said, Trump does not happen in a vacuum. I am not, I also am not an optimistic person, but I do believe there are more of them that want freedom, that want liberation, that want fairness, that want equity than there are of what we saw in Madison Square Garden. But what does it say when it becomes, at least it's not Kamala Harris, when we have Democrats who are like, well, at least it's not Trump? I don't know. I don't know what that looks like and how that's landing with people when it's like, well, we have to always be the ones who compromise with this level of vitriol, because I guarantee if there was a way to get some of those people in Madison Square Garden, some of those, you know, those tokens, some of those, you know, again, diversification of white supremacy necessary for survival, more Black people, more Latino people, more indigenous people platforming and being the face of this kind of rancid racism, I guarantee you some people could say, we can get some votes out of there. They would go there before they probably platform some people who are talking about Israel and Palestine. That's a problem. That's a problem. So to me, moving forward, Democrats still have to be stronger, have to have faith in the base, have to have faith in the people who they are claiming they want to come out and vote for them, to actually come out and vote for them.
Tim, I want to have you speak to that before we pass the mic to Kirsten.
Yeah, well, I think she's 100% right. You know, the Democrats are going to have to do two things at once, and they're not always easy to do at the same time. One is, of course, yes, in moments where you are facing real fascism, and we are, it's not a word that's being overused. It is appropriate. It does apply. It is important and has been important in every society where authoritarianism and fascism have been on the brink of coming to fruition, to create these broad coalitions where people do put aside some of their day-to-day differences in order to stop the biggest threat. That is actually smart strategy. But the second thing that they must do is remember they are leading that coalition, right? It is not the Lincoln Project that is leading that coalition. It is not the Liz Cheney's. And as long as they are willing to stand up and say that, like, hey, Liz Cheney, you don't have a home? Okay, well, you can be part of this home, but here's what you're going to have to get behind. And if you don't like that, you can go start a third party. You can go start a fourth party. Y'all can fracture 5 different ways to Sunday. But we are going to stand on principle about this and this and this and this, because that's the only way. Part of Trump's support, I don't think it's a huge amount. But do I think it's enough to potentially make the difference in elections? Yes. Part of his support is there is this subset of Americans who are not necessarily motivated first and foremost by the racism. They're not necessarily motivated first and foremost by the sexism. What they're motivated by is just this almost childlike desire to have somebody running who just says what's on their mind, right? Just this unfiltered, says what's on their mind, bold and brave, and doesn't care what folks think. I'm not saying the Democrats need someone without a filter, because adults have filters. Non-filter is like for 9-year-olds. But at the same time, we could sort of move in the direction of saying, you know what, we're going to take positions that we know are popular with the broad mass of people, even if they're not popular with the elites who give us money. Right? Even if they're not popular with the folks on Wall Street who now finance both parties' campaigns. Even if they're not going to make a bunch of tech bros happy and it's going to upset the crypto boys. Like, at some point, if you stand on principle, you will start to bring in people who might not even agree with you on all those things, but who appreciate and respect the boldness. And that's something the Democrats haven't had for a very long time. The Dukakisification of the Democratic Party has been going on since '88, and it continues.
Yeah, there's no boldness here. I want to come back to Kirsten because that concerns me. And I think that, after the election, I always say this on my show, after we get VP Harris in office, I do think that we need to have a real conversation about the future of this two-party system, the future of the Democratic Party, and the fact that the boldness that we need to deal with the Republican Party at this moment is being lost. We're not picking it up. I understand that we're very polite. We try to play by the rules, but we have become institutionalists. Therefore, we are not standing up to a party that is making its bread and butter off of bullying, not just us, but everyone who looks like us, everyone who's trying to figure out who they are at this moment. The bullying effect is working. I think our strategy is to scare people into voting. Oh my goodness, you don't want Trump. It's so scary. Well, there are a lot of economically challenged black and white folks. You know what? How much more scary can it get? I mean, I haven't had a good meal in a while, so you tell me how much more I have to lose. Yeah. You can't scare me into voting. I have nothing left to lose. So telling me that I'm going to lose democracy actually means nothing to me when my child is going to school and there are metal detectors at the door. Losing democracy means nothing when I can't pay my rent. And I think that there's another strategy the Democratic Party has to adopt beyond this election, which I get. I want to come back to you, Kirsten, because I was really moved by what you said. White supremacy never compromises. We know it never capitulates. It never comes to the table because it doesn't have to. And so I want to ask if you could talk a little bit about framing that for us, thinking about the media and how some major media outlets have handled this election, because what they're showing us is in order for us to be heard, we have to capitulate, we have to compromise, but they don't have to.
I mean, Kaye, I often go back to, this is a mainstream media who, instead of questioning the institution of slavery, ran lost and found slave ads. Right? This is a media that has always been complicit in platforming white supremacy and emboldening white supremacy. So even though we have come so far, if we have not addressed and really restructure is such a soft word, torn down the institution as it is and built something new, is always going to be in the crevices. It's always going to be in the corners. What I saw on CNN yesterday, on Abby Phillips' show with the Republican, what is his name, Tim? Help me out. Is it Ryan Gerdusky?
Gerdusky,
yes.
Yeah.
Gerdusky, yes. Talking to Mehdi Hassan and telling him, I hope you don't have a pager. I hope your pager doesn't
go off. Yeah.
On that, what kind of comfort have we provided white supremacists in this country where they would even feel comfortable enough to say something like that on the airwaves? To even feel comfortable enough to say that, and then to double down on it in a way. But didn't you say Hamas, which he meant Hezbollah? He didn't even know what he was talking about. That's one other thing. Just ignorant and hate-filled, being platformed on our mainstream media stages in the interest of so-called objectivity.
Well, go ahead.
That's another kind of violence. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah.
No, and CNN, to their credit, has now said that Gerdusky won't be back, but he's going to be on other networks.
Absolutely.
He's not going to be run out of the club of talking head, cognitariat, professional, mouth runners. He's going to continue to be on, even though and just in case people, listening don't get the reference, like, this is a reference to Israel's intelligence services blowing people up using their phones and pagers. And so, in a sense, what he is saying, whether one thinks he's advocating that happening to Mehdi Hassan or whether he's just making a joke about the other people to whom it did happen, right? It's bloodthirsty, but it is entirely par for the course. And I also think, so the media does that. They platform people like that. They do it all the time. They platform Scott Jennings over there, who will never, ever condemn anything that Donald Trump says, will rationalize anything that he says, no matter how racist, no matter how vile. And then we've got these other media outlets. We've got the LA Times, we've got Washington Post, both unwilling, their editorial boards ready to endorse Vice President Harris, and their billionaire owners in both cases step in and go, well, not so fast. And they essentially override the people whose job it is to editorialize and make those kind of decisions. Now, if anyone really wants to tell me that that's not about those billionaires thinking about their class interests first, to hell with democracy. We don't care about that. Democracy is actually bad for billionaires. It's the only thing that checks their power. These are guys who want to control not just their individual companies, but want to curry favor with the potential fascist should he come into office. The owner of the LA Times, turns out he's a medical product investor who has to have products evaluated by the FDA, and he has to apply for patents under regulatory agencies. So he's trying to get in good in case Trump wins. You've got Bezos, who Trump threatened last time he was in office to impose these harsh new shipping requirements that would have affected Amazon. And I guess probably Jeff Bezos wants to curry some favor so that he can, cut into the SpaceX, rocket stuff, because he and Elon both want to send their phallic symbol rockets to Mars, because that's what megalomaniacal men do. It's like, look, I'm going to go conquer this virgin territory, because that's sort of what they get into. So he's trying to curry favor with a potential dictator, avoid retaliation, and as a result, compromising the journalistic integrity of the people who work for the companies that work for those two guys. That is about individuals saying, rich people saying, we're waging class war. Whether y'all want to get in the fight or not, we're waging class war. We're going to do what's good for us, and to hell with the rest of y'all. At some point, we're going to have to push back, not just on the racism and the sexism, but the class war that the rich have been fighting against working class people for a very long time and continue to wage, as evidenced by those non-endorsements.
And I think we don't let CNN off the hook. Yes, I understand they did. They pushed Ryan off. They said he's not going to be on. How many times have they had him on before this? Right. And how many times have we sat there and listened to CNN talking heads hold black people accountable for being killed by the police? I think we have seen all kind of editorials and comments when they make us the victim when they kill us. I get it. I understand the comment about the beeper, but I tell people you're up in arms about that. There were some other things specifically said about black people who were killed by the police. I did not see you up in arms when they were questioning whether or not Trayvon Martin was doing something wrong. They questioned whether Mike Brown did something wrong. They questioned whether every time we get killed, we are doing something wrong, rather than understanding the position that we're in. If we're going to hold them accountable for this, I say hold them accountable for all of it. Because there's been victimization of black folks on that station for a long time. I get what's happening. CNN, they, Abby Phillips doesn't want to be Don Lemon. I want to have point counterpoint. But when you point counterpoint yourself to where we get to this, we have to question, what is the purpose of media? Whenever we work for billionaires, there is someone controlling what we say and what we do. Now, I work for the media. I know I can't just get on the radio and say whatever I want to say. I am backed by a university that's backed by funding. So there's always a line that has to be told. And for us to pretend that, okay, well, it's CNN, it's just Jeff Bezos, just the Washington Post, it's all of it. The New York Times just happens to be our friend at this moment. But if we take a look at things they put in the New York Times about black people, about women, we should have canceled our subscription to them as well. I tell people you're canceling your Washington Post subscription, which I agree with, 200,000 people, which is less than 8% of how much money he makes. Have you also canceled Amazon Prime? You got to do both.
That's it.
You can't just say, I'm not going to get the Washington Post, but I need to have my deliveries tomorrow morning. It's got to be both and both rather than either or. And people do the either or dance, yes? Because you can get rid of WAPO. But let's do Amazon Prime. Let's really go in to where his true bread and butter is coming from, because it's not coming from the newspaper. We know where it's really coming from, Amazon Prime. That's why when people do the dance, I'm like, you know what? Let's not do the classist capitalistic dance, because you truly don't know that real tune. Because you can vote with social media. Can you vote with your dollar? And those are two different things.
I mean, I often say when you dance with devils, what does that make you?
Come on.
And I don't. When we look at a CNN, this myth of objectivity, we find ourselves in this vicious cycle, because what happens when people stop subscribing, rightful response, who gets laid off first? Black journalists, black reporters, the truth tellers, the people who they think are expendable, the people who they don't want them there anyway. Let's get rid of them. The DEI They don't want that. So then what happens where people aren't subscribing? Then we have a media that's even more focused on whiteness, even less inclusive than it has been in recent years. It's such a vicious cycle. And like we were saying earlier, the Democrats have to learn how to draw a harder line, have to be bolder, have to not buy into this mythology of both sidisms. You know, there is no compromising with white supremacy. There is none. And we have to be willing to say that. I also think about, you know, Malcolm Shabazz, Malcolm X's grandson, said this: the formula for public assassination is the character assassination before the physical assassination. So one has to be made killable before the eyes of the public in order for their eventual murder to then be deemed justifiable.
Yes.
That has always been media script, mainstream media script. That influences policies. You make Black people look scary enough, you make us look bad enough, that justifies police being in our neighborhood. That justifies more prisons being built. That justifies when you see a Mike Brown or a Trayvon Martin on the ground. Oh, what did he do? Because I saw on the news that this is how they are.
I want to come to you, Tim, with that. And thank you so much for that, Kirsten. This kind of media shaping that we see taking place, because part of these other outlets is the way they're shaping Kamala Harris. I mean, the way she's being covered is something that has to be discussed. People are asking questions about, for example, where's Stacey Abrams, where's Josh Shapiro, both of whom are out doing the work. But if media's not covering it, people don't believe it's happening. I mean, I believe in democratization of social media, but Elon Musk owns X. It's not a democratic platform anymore when he can mute you when he feels that you are doing too much. When I was doing critical race theory summer school with Kimberly Crenshaw and you, Tim Wise, this summer, I noticed that he muted me on X. Where I used to get 10,000 people, I got 3. I'm like, who are the 3 people that are, and it was after CRT summer school, he opened my platform back up. There's no more democratization of social media when there's a specific push by billionaires to own these resources.
Yeah. That happened to me at CRT summer school as well. It is interesting. He will chokehold progressive accounts for weeks at a time. Then he'll open it up just so you don't get smart to what he's doing. But if you pay attention, it's obvious what he's doing. And I know we're coming tight on time for this segment, but let me just say this before we're done. This is all the more reason why people who are progressive and want social justice are going to have to demand and follow more independent media, more Black and brown owned media, going to have to create their own media rather than, and I know we say this all the time, but this is the proof of it. You cannot rely on even those outlets that you think do a good job. You know, the Washington Post had done a decent job 4 years ago, as did a lot of media outlets covering the uprising. But as soon as the headlines changed and people's interest went the other way, then they went sideways. You cannot rely, as you said, on billionaires and large corporations to tell you the truth. You have to find the independent outlets and you have to do your own media reporting on what's going on. That's the only way that we're going to actually know what's happening in this country, because these folks are not going to tell us.
I'll come to you for the last comment, Kirsten, because what Tim is talking about, I agree with. I just don't think people are going to do the work. We are a short-memoried people, and we're dealing with a fatigue of issues. So if you're telling me I need to do more work, so I canceled the Washington Post, I'm canceling the New York Times, now I have to go find a media source and figure out whether it's reliable. Like, you're asking people to take on a whole nother level of understanding and work to a plate that's already full. So I want to end with you, Kirsten. So with that in mind, what do we do? If media is doing exactly what we've laid out here, what should people do as they're looking for answers and direction in the last few days before the election polls close on Tuesday?
I say it all the time. I know it's extra work, but we gotta work. We gotta work. We have to support Black media. We have to support independent media outlets. We have to support people who are not just reporting, but contextualizing what's going on. You know, there's stories about how proud we are to see, Michelle Obama and Kamala Harris on stage, and all that is true. We think about how, on a visceral level, especially as Black women, we know how exceptional they had to be to get to where they are, right? We know that, but it is also revolting that Black women are being taxed with saving saving a white supremacist settler colonial project. What does it mean? What do they have to compromise? Look to Black media sources, look to Black women, look to Black journalists who are able to contextualize this nation in the ways that are honest and fair. And by fair, I mean going back to the beginning, telling the story not in the middle, telling the story not with the, the confetti and all the other stuff that's going on right now, but telling the story about how hard it is, telling the story about the violence that she really is facing right now. That's a very, very real threat that Black women experience every day walking down the street. Imagine what she's going through.
And Tim, I want to come back to you just to kind of quickly see if there's any more fallout from this rally at Madison Square Garden.
Well, I think, there obviously is, and it's been fascinating. On the one hand, you could argue that the MAGA folks really, made a horrible mistake by having such overt expressions of racism against Puerto Ricans, against, Black folks, just the kinds of hatred and vitriol that we heard. But of course, they can't help themselves, right? They literally revert to type when left out in the wild. Like, they just can't avoid going back to that because that's sort of fundamentally who they are. And it has apparently galvanized a lot of Latino folk, particularly Puerto Ricans, but not exclusively Puerto Ricans, to recognize that whatever this outreach was to the Latino community, the broader Latino community, was obviously a smokescreen for what remains this overtly hateful, bigoted, anti-brown bias that goes along with their anti-Black bias, which they've always manifested. So that's happening. What's interesting too, though, about the rally that we hadn't talked about yet and hasn't been talked about as much is the way that rally really demonstrated the stuff that we at AAPF and Kimberly Crenshaw, our director, talks about all the time, the intersectionality of oppressions and discrimination. Because if you listen to the rhetoric, it's not just racist, right? There was blatant misogynoir on display at the same time, blatant sexism. So for instance, the one speaker talked about how Kamala Harris's pimp handlers, right? That is both a racialized image and obviously a gendered image in terms of essentially calling her a sex worker, right? And then from the reports that were all throughout the media, the best-selling T-shirt at the rally was one that says, "Don't vote for the hoe," spelled H-O-E, by the way, because, why would you know how to spell? I mean, they called her a garden tool. That's how smart these people are, right? But the fact that is the kind of thing, there were parents buying that shirt for their teenage daughters because apparently misogyny, and in this case misogynoir, is not a disqualifying kind of thing for the MAGA crowd. So that combination of racism and sexism is at the heart of what MAGA is, and they are proving that to us. As I said, before, when somebody shows you not just once, right, but dozens of times who they are, you probably ought to believe them. And it's been fascinating to watch MAGA try to rationalize the remarks of the comedian Tony Hinchcliffe and others, by saying, well, yeah, he called Puerto Rico a garbage dump, but, the other day, Joe Biden referred to all the Trump supporters as garbage. It's not what Biden did. Biden was referring to the garbage that came out of Hinchcliffe's mouth. It's rather obvious if you listen to it. Now, it was garbled and it wasn't clear because Joe Biden doesn't always speak in incredibly clear sentences. I think we know that. But to say that he was referring to all Trump supporters as garbage is not only not true, but it's precious that they would be so offended when Donald Trump has literally referred to all of America as a garbage dump, has referred to his opponents as trash, as human scum, as the enemy from within. All of these people, I think Shakespeare said, the lady doth protest too much. In this case, these bro dudes, these crypto dudes, they protest way too much because they are clearly the ones for whom bigotry is just sort of the fuel that moves their movement.
For those of us here in Baltimore, we're not surprised because Donald Trump turned his ire on us, called us a rat-infested garbage dump. So we know what it's like to be on the end of that. But we also know what it means to push back against it. And Kirsten, I want to come to you, particularly when I know that people are upset around the garbage comment, as they should be. But I would like to draw as much attention to don't vote for the hoe, to pimp handlers. I'm like, there was a lot happening that we need to look at because it's really indicative not just of Donald Trump. Because I always like to say Trump is part of a machine that is well oiled behind him. He's just the face of it. But the Trumplicans and the Republicans are working this machine all the way through to try to get him into office so they can then put in place all the other things that need to happen to completely flip this country in their direction.
First I want to shout out Tim for saying misogynoir, and that's why, and Moya Bailey, that's why you are the 8th wokest white man in America, Tim Wise, for saying misogynoir. To be honest, Kay, there's so much. You're right. The pimp handlers, it wasn't just, it was so much just a hodgepodge of racism, of misogynoir, of bigotry, of xenophobia. But really, in media land, in kind of the discourse I'm seeing on social media, what I've become increasingly annoyed by is the way that it's been framed, that the rally has been framed. So primarily for the reason that I discussed last week around policing, there are some people, white people in particular, who are kind of wrapped tightly in this manufactured obliviousness, tripping over themselves to draw a line between blatant white supremacy and themselves, turning the other way when it's convenient, expressing outrage when it's trending, and we have to call that out. If not, I liken it to kind of like finishing a course of antibiotics prescribed for an infection, because you start feeling better, right? But then the sickness just keeps coming back stronger and stronger because you didn't eradicate the root of it. I remember when The Handmaid's Tale dovetailed with the SCOTUS overturning Roe v. Wade, and I was not moved at all by the handmaiden cosplay and the rallies and the signs splashed across social media that the U.S. was turning into Gilead, because it is much more terrifying to me, that the same white supremacist, patriarchal, misogynist, capitalist violence that takes place in a nation that lies about being free, and that my rights can be stripped away when I'm wearing a sundress and heels. In concert with that violence, y'all, structural and otherwise, the lie has always been what bothers me, right? Like Dr. King said, be true to what you said on paper. But in so many ways, this nation has been true to what is written on paper, right? We've just become distracted while our leaders consistently lie about the depth and caliber of this nation's character. Because what's happening now, and what's been happening since this nation's inception, is a nation that's founded on genocide, is a nation that's founded on land theft, slavery, and rape. This is on the record. So we didn't need Madison Square Garden to be afraid to look like what is going on. The lie, to me, one nation under God, liberty and justice for all, is enough. And then we have some people in the U.S. who love to call these violent cowards Nazis, as if that's where their evil originated. That right there, and I know we've talked about this, I think, a little bit before, but Nazis and Hitler studied the Black codes. Laws enacted in Confederate states remained intact despite the Emancipation Proclamation. In Mein Kampf, Hitler praised the United States. In 1935, we talk about the Nuremberg laws. The Black codes were the foundation of that. They wouldn't exist without the Black codes, right? James Whitman talks about that in Hitler's American Model. He was inspired. He was enamored with the way that white supremacy was codified in the United States. So even now, in 2 states, California and Nevada, slavery is on the ballot. Prop 6, Question 4, respectively eliminating so-called slavery loopholes, because slavery did not end, now in 2024. So yes, I 100% believe that Trump intentionally held this Klan Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, and it was a Nazi, it was a Nazi dog whistle. But what we saw in Madison Square Garden was pure, undiluted, uncut U.S. homegrown white supremacy, and we can't let anybody, even the so-called good ones, pretend it is otherwise.
I want to keep going down this line because when we start thinking about misogynoir, when we start thinking about sexism, I immediately think about Donald Trump of all people. And again, I can't get that garbage truck out of my mind here, because that to me just symbolizes so much. But here's a man who was comfortable saying in 2024, where you have so many women who are going to be the deciding voice in this election, saying we're going to help you whether you like it or not. I think about that, and I also think about the push coming out of the feminist community saying, look, women, your vote is your own. Your husband does not control your vote. You can go by yourselves. I am thinking that in 2024, for us to explicitly have to explain to women to not be threatened by your husband, that you can go by yourself. He should not be looking over your shoulder while you vote. Line that up to, we're going to help you whether you like it or not. And you can still see the dilemma that women find themselves in at this moment when you start talking about controlling your vote.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that commercial in particular that's been running, that I think Julia Roberts is doing the voiceover for, the fact that has had to be made, first of all, apparently, and the fact that so many guys in the MAGA orbit in particular are freaking out about the existence of that commercial is really revealing, right? I mean, on the one hand, if you weren't trying to intimidate your wife, your girlfriend, your female partner, why would you be bothered? You could just laugh it off and be like, that's a real waste of money. Why are they throwing, I would never intimidate my wife. I would, it's precisely because it speaks to something real that you've got Jesse Waters on Fox, who was Bill O'Reilly's protege there. You got Jesse Waters absolutely apoplectic at the thought that his wife might go into the voting booth and do something counter to his wishes, that she might fake her support for Donald Trump, as if faking her political views is the only thing that Jesse Waters' wife has ever faked, right? The idea that somehow that's going to be the first time she ever lied to Jesse is fascinating in and of itself. But the reality that he's so freaked out by it, the idea that somehow women should think for themselves, and how dare they? This is what is being said in right-wing media right now. You've got folks on MAGA Twitter who are openly saying, let's repeal the 19th Amendment. And although this level of misogyny, misogynoir, sexism, all of that has existed in this country since its inception, it isn't the case that in the last 20 or 30 years you had a lot of people saying that one. You haven't had a lot of people saying, let's get rid of, the women's suffrage. That is actually not that that's new, because obviously for most of history women didn't have the vote. But the fact that we're having that as an openly articulated concept at this particular moment, and folks are not thinking anything of it. Folks are not talking about it. We're not really, people are saying, oh, that's silly. No one really means that. But the more that kind of stuff gets said, the more that men freak out at the thought that their women might have their own independent views, the more that we lower the threshold to that level of previously unacceptable, at least in the last 10, 20 years, misogyny. Same thing's happening with racism. We are hearing the open articulation of saying, let's not have the right to vote unless you're a property owner. Let's not have the right to vote unless you can pass a civics test. That stuff has been said by right-wingers going back to the Tea Party days when Obama first became president, that we need to limit the vote in the way that we used to in the 50s and the 30s and the 1800s. And that kind of stuff has now become normal. We have to have a conversation after this election, regardless of who wins, about how we have allowed culturally the threshold for acceptable white supremacy and acceptable misogyny to reach this particular level, because it ought to disturb everyone.
Now, Kirsten, I want to have you answer that, but I want to add another layer to it, because earlier this week at AAPF's Race Forward messaging, Barbara Arnwine said something that has stuck with me. She said that she met, while she was out, doing the campaign work, she met 3 African-American men who said, we just voted for Donald Trump. And she said, well, why did you vote for Donald Trump? Because we're voting against Kamala Harris's Project 2025. So this kind of mixed messaging that's happening, the duality that you talk about that black voters have to hold as black women thinking about these issues, watching the misinformation and disinformation in our community. Can you talk about all of that? Because even that's a part of vote, and we're going to make sure we help you whether we like you or not. And that feeling of, black voters don't know what they're doing. We have to help them whether they want our help or not.
I thought you misspoke for a second, Kaye. I was like, who did Project 2025? That there's a lot going on, I think, with black women in particular, where we have to hold all the critiques that we have with the very real threat of violence that we face, not just with our bodies in our communities, with our children, with reproductive rights. We talk about reproductive justice. It's not just being about abortion rights, but the rights to raise our children in free and safe environments. And also to have conversations with our sons, with our brothers, with our husbands. I will say that I do think that black men in a big way are being scapegoated for what white women are doing. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But it is also true that misogynoir that we're talking about is so deeply invested, is ingrained, is so deeply this push where masculinity, where power starts to look like white supremacy. That is a very, very real problem. So it really just comes down to, yes, we have criticisms, but like Tim said, we're seeing something now that should have never been allowed to happen, and there needs to be very, very real conversations about that, because how we got here is going to help us not stay here and not push it further than what it is now.
I know that people are concerned about Tuesday. In many states, early voting ended for us here in Maryland. It ended last night. There were lines out the door at all the early voting places. People are, of course, working hard to make sure that they are a part of this very important election. But I'm wondering, as we go into this weekend where people are settled with the issues, and we know we're getting all kinds of advertising, whether they're texting us, they're calling us on television, like we're getting it from every single end. Tim, I want to come to you. As people are trying to cut through the noise, and that's really the purpose of our series, to help cut through the noise, what are some things they should be thinking about going into this final weekend where they have to show up at the polls starting at 5:45 a.m., at least here in Maryland, to cast a final vote? Like, that's it. This is the last time you can speak on this particular election on Tuesday.
I know we always say that this is the most important election in history or in memory. But, it just so happens that we are on a trajectory as a society where that has been true the last several cycles. Just because it sounds cliche doesn't mean it isn't accurate. And so people have to recognize the importance of it. And I would recommend people got to get there as early as possible, because the later that you wait, the longer that line's going to get. And my big fear going into Election Day is there's going to be disruption. There are going to be people who are going to be screwing with the folks in line. There's going to be attempted intimidation, particularly in the swing states, right? We already know that there are and have been drop boxes in several states that have been set on fire in the hopes of destroying ballots. And most of that was in states that probably aren't swing states in the presidential election, but there are down ballot races that are potentially affected in that. So if one is going to go to the polls, go early, make sure that you are there. And if you have to stand in line, stand in line, because this is that important. And I hope folks have been able to vote early. And if they have, fantastic. Make sure that your vote has been counted. Those areas that have mail-in voting, there's a way to track that. Make sure that it has been counted. If you dropped your mail in a drop box, if you live in a place that has one of those, make sure that that vote has been counted. There's a way to follow up on that. And if it hasn't, go and cast a ballot provisionally. I believe in most states you're allowed to do that. I know you can in California. At least make sure that your vote gets counted one way or the other.
And we also want to add, folks, if you are voting by absentee ballot, you need to make sure that you are signing the ballot and that you are dating it, because there are some states across the South where they're kicking out ballots because it doesn't have a date, as if there'd be another election day 2024, but they're kicking ballots out. They're finding every way, from what's happening in Virginia, where they're trying to kick people off the rolls to even be able to vote. We know it's that type of season that we're in, where they're doing everything possible to suppress the vote. So I come to you, Kirsten, with the same question with Tim, and then just thinking about, as we're going forward and what is happening this weekend, what else should people think about? Because I know for folks in the Black community, which I've been talking to, there is this sense where we're always being told it's like, vote like our lives depend on it. It's the last important, the most important. They hear it a lot. And it's what Tim said. Just because you hear it a lot doesn't mean it's not necessarily true this time. So I want to have you speak to that and then kind of set us on our path where things we should be thinking about going into this final weekend.
A couple of things that come to mind. One, is thinking about Donald Trump saying that he was going to protect women, whether they liked it or not. And the fact that this is a man who has been accused of rape and sexual harassment, including non-consensual kissing, found guilty of sexual assault. He is not a protector of anyone. He is a predator. He is a predator. And so it was traumatic to think about this for me, and I think for a lot of voters going forward, is sexual violence is the second highest form of police brutality after excessive force. So the very same officers sworn to serve and protect are hiding behind their badges to violate and destroy. So when I hear Trump, who has advocated for more militarized police forces, who has gleefully promised more police violence against Black and brown people, talk about he'll protect women whether they like it or not. I hear former Kansas City Police Department Detective Roger Kolupski, who was supposed to serve and protect people, yet he stands accused of raping and kidnapping Black women for decades. I think about a Daniel Hawksclaw, Oklahoma police officer who was arrested and in prison for assaulting and raping multiple Black women and girls. From the mouth of a predator like Donald Trump, who speaks the language of violence, the promise, not the threat, of codified federal violence and emboldened state violence. Protect women, Kaye, even without whether they like it or not. At the end of the day, sounds like a precursor to assault, constitutional and otherwise. We are looking at polling places where there was an 18-year-old kid who had a machete at elderly people who were out for Kamala Harris. We have, the white man in was it South Carolina, who punched the person. We had the one in Texas who put the finger, they had to kick him out. Like, we're seeing violence at the polls, and Black women, Black people are once again putting their lives on the line for this democracy, for this country. So we have to be careful. We have to be safe. And I will just end with this. Whatever happens at the end of the day, we have to wake up Wednesday and keep fighting and continue to fight toward freedom, toward liberation, towards joy, towards peace, and not the negative peace, which is like the absence of tension. We all know, but a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And I'm just looking forward to seeing you all on the other side, because we got a rocky few days ahead of us.
I like that. See you on the other side. I felt that was something I used to say all the time during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm like, folks, I'll see you on the other side of the war. We're
Yeah.
back at that point.